He had lost his own daughter years ago. When he saw the pregnant young woman trapped in the fire, his decision made everyone present cry with emotion. The alarm buzzed at 6:30 a.m., just like every morning. Mr. Johnson's hand moved automatically to silence it, his fingers finding the familiar button in the dim light. He sat up slowly, joints creaking, and reached for the picture frame on his nightstand. "Morning, Martha," he whispered, touching the glass that protected the photo of his late wife. His eyes drifted to another frame on the wall, showing a young woman in a graduation cap. That one he couldn't look at for long. The floorboards groaned under his feet as he made his way to the bathroom of his small Detroit apartment. The mirror showed what it always did, a 68-year-old black man with gray hair and tired eyes. He splashed cold water on his face, ignoring the drip from the leaky faucet. The landlord hadn't fixed it, just like he hadn't fixed anything else in the building. In the kitchen, Mr. Johnson went through his morning routine. Coffee first, 1 scoop of grounds, not too like when Martha was alive. The coffee maker sputtered and steamed, filling the small space with a familiar aroma. "Don't forget your pills, old man," he muttered to himself, sorting through the orange bottles on the counter. He'd have to skip the blood pressure medication this week. The choice between medicine and fixing the broken window in his bedroom wasn't really a choice at all with winter coming. The morning paper waited outside his door, where Jimmy, the delivery boy, always left it. Mr. Johnson picked it up and headed to his small balcony, stepping carefully over the worn threshold. His chair, the old wooden one Martha had painted white years ago, creaked as he settled into it. The headlines were the usual mix of bad news and worse news. His eyes caught on a small article about building code violations in the area. He glanced at the cracking walls of his building, the exposed wiring near the fire escape. They'd gotten notices about it, but nothing ever changed. A sound from the stairwell caught his attention. Lisa Chun, the pregnant woman from the 3rd floor, was struggling with grocery bags. "Here, let me help you with those," Mr. Johnson called out, setting down his paper. "Oh, Mr. Johnson, you don't have to dash," Lisa started to protest, but he was already taking the heavier bags. "Nonsense. Young lady in your condition shouldn't be carrying all this." He smiled, noting how her belly had grown bigger since last week. "Must be getting close now." 2 more months, Lisa beamed, resting a hand on her stomach. "The doctor says everything looks good." They climbed the stairs slowly, Mr. Johnson hiding his shortness of breath. The bags weren't heavy, but these days everything seemed to take more effort. "Thank you so much," Lisa said when they reached her floor. "Would you like to come in for some tea?" Mr. Johnson shook his head. "Maybe another time. Gotta check my mail." He didn't mention that his knees were already complaining about the stairs. Back in his apartment, he found another notice from building management stuffed under his door. More warnings about electrical problems. He added it to the pile on his coffee table, next to last month's overdue heating bill. The afternoon sun found him at Rose Hill Cemetery, standing before a well-maintained headstone. Martha Johnson, it read, followed by dates that still hurt to look at. "Should have seen Lisa today, Martha," he said quietly. "Reminds me of Sarah when she was expecting." His voice caught on their daughter's name. The plot next to Martha's was newer, the grass still not fully grown over it. The sun was setting when he returned home. The building's hallway lights flickered as he climbed the stairs, casting strange shadows on the walls. There was a smell in the air, something burning, maybe electrical. Mr. Johnson wrinkled his nose, making a mental note to mention it to the super tomorrow. He was heating up soup for dinner when the first scream started. High-pitched, terrified screams that cut through the thin walls like knives. Then more voices joined in, and the smell of smoke grew stronger. Mr. Johnson moved to his door and opened it. Thick, black smoke rolled down the hallway like a living thing. "Fire!" someone shouted from above. "Everyone get out!" The soup can clattered forgotten to the floor as Mr. Johnson grabbed his keys. The smoke was getting thicker, and somewhere in the building, a child started crying. Through the haze, he heard Lisa's voice calling for help from upstairs. "Anybody, please!" Mr. Johnson stood in his doorway, the heat already building around him, and made a decision that would change everything. The smoke stung Mr. Johnson's eyes as he stepped into the hallway. The emergency lights cast an eerie glow through the haze, turning everything a sickly orange. "Anyone still up there?" he called out, his voice rough from the smoke. More screams answered him, mixed with the sound of breaking glass and crackling flames. Mrs. Rodriguez from apartment 1B stumbled out of her door, clutching her cat. "My husband," she coughed. "He can't walk well." "Which apartment?" Mr. Johnson was already moving. "1B, please." The smoke was thicker near the floor. Mr. Johnson pulled his shirt over his nose and ducked low, feeling his way along the wall to 1B. The door was open, and inside he found Mr. Rodriguez struggling with his walker. "Come on, friend," Mr. Johnson said, wrapping an arm around the older man's waist. "Leave that walker. We're getting out of here. My medicines." "No time." Mr. Johnson's back protested as he half-carried Mr. Rodriguez toward the exit. The heat was building, making sweat run down his face despite the winter chill outside. They made it to the building's entrance where a small crowd had gathered. Someone took Mr. Rodriguez from him. Through the glass doors, Mr. Johnson could see red lights flashing, fire trucks arriving. "The Thompsons!" Mrs. Rodriguez suddenly cried. "They're still up there, second floor with their grandchildren." Mr. Johnson looked back at the smoke-filled hallway. His lungs burned, but he turned around. The stairs creaked under his feet as he climbed, keeping close to the wall where the steps were strongest. He could hear children crying above him. "Mr. Thompson," he shouted. "Mrs. Thompson." "Here," came a faint reply. "We can't get the door open." The second floor was worse than the first. The smoke was so thick he could barely see his hand in front of his face. He followed the sound of crying to apartment 2C. The door was stuck, warped from the heat. "Stand back." Mr. Johnson threw his shoulder against the door. Pain shot through his arm, but the door gave way. Inside, he found the elderly couple with their 2 grandchildren huddled in the living room. "The stairs," he coughed. "They're still clear. Go now." He helped Mrs. Thompson with the younger child, while Mr. Thompson carried the older one. The descent was slow, too slow. Mr. Johnson could hear the fire roaring above them, feel the building shuddering. They emerged into the cold night air just as the first firefighters were entering the building. Mr. Johnson bent over, hands on his knees, sucking in deep breaths. His throat felt like he'd swallowed broken glass. "Is anyone else inside?" a firefighter asked him. Before he could answer, he heard Lisa's scream again, fainter now, but unmistakable. "Third floor." The same floor Sarah had been trapped on, all those years ago. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Sarah, 8 months pregnant, trapped in their old apartment building. The firefighters arriving too late. Martha never recovering from the loss, fading away year by year until cancer finally took her too. "Sir, you need to stay back," the firefighter said, grabbing his arm as Mr. Johnson started toward the entrance. "There's a pregnant woman up there." Mr. Johnson pulled away. "Third floor. We'll get her. Stay here." But Mr. Johnson could see the flames now, licking out of the second-floor windows. The firefighters were dealing with multiple spots, calling for backup. They wouldn't reach the third floor in time. Not again, he thought. Not like Sarah. His body moved before his mind could catch up. Back into the burning building, ignoring the shouts behind him. The heat was worse now, making the air shimmer. Debris fell from the ceiling as he reached the stairs. The first step nearly broke his resolve. His legs trembled, chest tight with more than just smoke. He was too old for this, too weak. What could one old man do? Sarah's face flashed in his mind, smiling in her graduation photo. Then Lisa's face, with that same hopeful look she always had. "Lord, give me strength," he whispered and started climbing. The stairwell became a tunnel of heat and darkness. Each step was a battle against his screaming muscles and the voice in his head telling him to turn back. Halfway up, he had to stop, doubled over, and coughing so hard he thought he might pass out. A crash from above made him look up. Through the smoke, he could see flames starting to breach the third-floor hallway. "Lisa," he called out, his voice barely a croak. "Lisa, can you hear me?" A weak cough answered him. Close. She was close. Mr. Johnson straightened up, joints popping, and forced himself to keep climbing. The metal handrail was hot enough to burn, but he gripped it anyway. His vision swam, dark spots dancing at the edges. I'm coming, he wheezed, though he wasn't sure if Lisa could hear him. Just hold on. He reached the third-floor landing just as another section of ceiling collapsed behind him, blocking the way back down. The flames were spreading faster now, eating up the dry old walls like they were paper. Mr. Johnson stood there, swaying, watching the fire advance. The choice was made for him now. Forward was the only way left to go. The third-floor hallway was an inferno. Smoke rolled across the ceiling in thick waves, and the wallpaper curled and blackened in the heat. Mr. Johnson dropped to his hands and knees, pressing his face close to the floor where the air was slightly clearer. "Lisa!" The shout tore at his raw throat. "Which apartment?" A weak cough answered him. 3D. Help. 3D. At the end of the hall, Mr. Johnson began crawling, counting doors through the haze. His hands found broken glass, pieces of fallen ceiling. Each movement sent daggers of pain through his arthritic joints. "Keep making noise," he called out. "Let me hear you." Another cough, closer now. The heat was incredible, like being inside an oven. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. His lungs felt like they were filled with razor blades. Halfway down the hall, his arms started shaking. "Too old for this," he muttered, then immediately thought of Sarah. She'd been alone when the smoke took her. No one had reached her in time. A loud crack from above made him look up. The ceiling was sagging, wooden beams groaning under the stress. He had minutes, maybe less. "Lisa!" His voice was barely a whisper now. "I'm almost there." He reached 3D. The door was hot but not yet burning. Mr. Johnson pushed himself to his knees, grabbed the handle, and yanked it open. Smoke billowed out, making him stumble back. "In here!" Lisa's voice came from somewhere inside. Mr. Johnson pulled his shirt over his nose and entered. The apartment was a maze of smoke and shadows. He followed the sound of Lisa's breathing to the bathroom, where she lay curled on the floor near the toilet. "Mr. Johnson?" Her eyes were unfocused, one hand protectively over her swollen belly. "Can you walk?" She tried to stand but collapsed against him. "My legs so dizzy." Another crack from above, louder this time. Pieces of ceiling plaster rained down on them. Mr. Johnson looked at Lisa, then at the door, calculating distances and his own strength. "Lord," he whispered, "I know I ain't been to church much lately, but if you're listening..." He bent down, slid one arm under Lisa's knees and the other behind her back. His back screamed in protest as he straightened up. Lisa wasn't heavy, but he was old, tired, and running on fumes. "Hold on to my neck," he wheezed. The hallway was worse now. Flames had breached several apartments, turning the corridor into a gauntlet of fire and falling debris. Mr. Johnson hugged the wall, trying to keep Lisa as far from the flames as possible. "Stay with me," he said when he felt her go limp. "Talk to me. Tell me about the baby." "Girl," Lisa mumbled. "Going to name her Joy." "Joy. That's pretty. Keep talking." Each step was agony. His arms trembled with fatigue, and his lungs seemed to have forgotten how to process air. The stairwell entrance looked a mile away through the smoke. Behind them, something collapsed with a thunderous crash. The force of it nearly knocked Mr. Johnson off his feet. He pressed against his back like a physical wall. Almost there, he lied, not sure if Lisa could even hear him anymore. Her breathing was shallow and rapid against his chest. 5 more steps. His vision was starting to tunnel, dark spots dancing at the edges. The smoke was thicker now, making him stumble. 4 steps. His foot caught on something, nearly sending them both down. Only desperate instinct kept him upright. 3 steps. The roar of the fire was deafening now. Or maybe that was just the blood pounding in his ears. 2 steps. Sarah's face flashed in his mind again. "Not this time, baby girl. Not this time." 1 step. The stairwell door was right there, hanging off its hinges. Mr. Johnson crashed through its shoulder first, nearly falling down the stairs before catching himself on the railing. The stairs were an obstacle course of fallen debris and water from the firefighters' hoses below. Mr. Johnson's legs moved on autopilot, 1 step at a time. Each landing was a brief pause to readjust his grip on Lisa, who hung limp in his arms. "Stay with me." He kept muttering, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to Lisa or himself. Almost there. Almost there. Second floor. The smoke was thinner here, but the heat was still intense. His arms felt like lead, muscles screaming for relief. But he couldn't stop. Stopping meant dying, and he hadn't carried Lisa this far to fail now. A firefighter appeared through the haze below, then another. Voices shouted up to him, but the words made no sense. His world had narrowed to the next step, and the next and the next. First floor. The exit was visible now, a rectangle of flashing red lights and cold night air. Mr. Johnson's legs buckled. Strong hands grabbed him, took Lisa from his arms. He tried to hold on to her, but his fingers wouldn't work anymore. Got them, someone shouted. Get a medic over here. The cold air hit him like a slap as they emerged from the building. Mr. Johnson saw Lisa being lifted onto a stretcher, an oxygen mask already on her face. Then his own legs gave out completely, and the world started to go dark around the edges. The last thing he heard before consciousness slipped away was a paramedic saying, "She's breathing." They're both breathing. Not like Sarah, he thought. Not this time. Then the darkness took him. The hospital ceiling came into focus slowly, its fluorescent lights making Mr. Johnson squint. Something was beeping nearby, a heart monitor, he realized. The oxygen mask on his face felt strange, but his burning lungs welcomed the cool air it provided. "Welcome back, Mr. Johnson," a nurse said, appearing at his bedside. "You've been out for a few hours." He tried to speak, but only managed a weak cough. His throat felt like he'd swallowed sandpaper. "Lisa," he finally croaked. "The pregnant woman, she's stable. Both she and the baby are doing fine, thanks to you." The nurse checked his four. "Though you gave us quite a scare yourself. Smoke inhalation, second-degree burns on your arms, and exhaustion." Mr. Johnson became aware of the bandages on his arms and hands. Every breath hurt, but knowing Lisa was alive made the pain bearable. "How bad?" he asked. "The burns will heal. We're more concerned about your lungs right now. Dr. Patterson wants to keep you here for at least a few days." "A few days?" Mr. Johnson closed his eyes. He couldn't afford a few hours in this place, let alone days. The door opened, and a doctor entered, young, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Johnson, I'm Dr. Patterson. How are you feeling?" "Like I smoked 1,000 cigarettes at once?" "That's to be expected. Your lungs took quite a hit." Dr. Patterson picked up his chart. "I understand you carried a woman down 3 flights of stairs through heavy smoke. Had to be done? At your age, with your medical history." The doctor shook his head. "It's remarkable you managed it. But you should know, a few more minutes in that smoke, and we might be having a very different conversation." A nurse appeared in the doorway. "Doctor? The patient in 4B is asking for Mr. Johnson. Says she needs to see him." "Lisa." Mr. Johnson tried to sit up, but his muscles protested violently. "Easy there," Dr. Patterson said. "She's not going anywhere, and neither are you right now. Rest. We'll see about a visit later if your numbers improve." The next few hours passed in a haze of medical checks and medication. Mr. Johnson drifted in and out of sleep, his dreams filled with smoke and fire and Sarah's face. Each time he woke, the pain in his chest seemed a little less severe, but his worry about the mounting hospital bills grew stronger. Around midnight, he woke to find a man sitting beside his bed, Asian, middle-aged, wearing an expensive suit despite the late hour. "Mr. Johnson?" The man leaned forward. "I'm David Chun, Lisa's father." Mr. Johnson tried to sit up straighter. "How is she?" "Thanks to you. She and my grandchild will live." Mr. Chin's voice cracked slightly. "The doctor say if she'd been in that smoke any longer." He cleared his throat. "I have no words to express my gratitude. Anyone would have done the same?" "No." Mr. Chun shook his head firmly. "The firefighters couldn't reach her in time. You were the only one who went back in, the only one who could have saved them both." Mr. Johnson looked away, uncomfortable with the gratitude in the other man's eyes. "Just did what needed doing. The building manager told me about your apartment, about all the residents being displaced." Mr. Chin reached into his jacket pocket. "I own some properties in the better part of town. There's a unit available in one of my buildings. It's yours if you want it." Mr. Chun, I can't, please. Mr. Chun held up a hand. My daughter and grandchild are alive because of you. Let me do this. Before Mr. Johnson could respond, a commotion in the hallway caught their attention. Through the door's window, they could see hospital staff rushing past. Code Blue and 4B, someone shouted. Get Dr. Patterson. Mr. Johnson's heart monitor spiked. 4B. That's Lisa's room. He yanked the oxygen mask off and swung his legs over the side of the bed. His body screamed in protest, but he ignored it. Mr. Chun tried to stop him, but Mr. Johnson pushed past him, using the 4-pole for support. The hallway tilted and swayed as he stumbled toward Lisa's room. Medical staff rushed past him, their voices urgent but professional. Blood pressure dropping. Possible placental abruption. Get her to the ER now. Mr. Johnson reached Lisa's doorway just as they were wheeling her out. Her face was pale, oxygen mask fogging with each shallow breath. One hand rested on her belly, just like Sarah's had in those final moments. Lisa. He tried to call out, but his smoke-damaged voice was barely a whisper. A nurse spotted him. Mr. Johnson, you need to get back to bed. His legs chose that moment to give out. The last thing he saw was Lisa being rushed toward the ER, and then strong arms were catching him as the world went dark again. When he came to, he was back in his bed, oxygen mask replaced. Dr. Patterson stood over him, looking stern. That was extremely unwise, the doctor said. You're in no condition to be walking around. Lisa, Mr. Johnson managed. Is she? Dr. Patterson's expression softened slightly. They got her to surgery in time. She's stable now. The baby's heartbeat is strong. But Mr. Johnson, he leaned closer. You've already saved her life once. Let us handle it from here. Your job now is to heal. Mr. Johnson closed his eyes, feeling tears leak from the corners. Not like Sarah. Thank God. Not like Sarah. Rest, Dr. Patterson said more gently. I promise we'll keep you updated on her condition. As the doctor left, Mr. Johnson became aware of Mr. Chin still sitting beside him. The man's eyes were red, but he managed a small smile. You see, he said quietly. Even half dead, you still try to save her. Now will you please let me help you? Mr. Johnson was too exhausted to argue anymore. He nodded slightly, then let the medication pull him back into sleep, where the flames couldn't reach him. 3 days later, Mr. Johnson sat in a wheelchair by Lisa's hospital bed, his own 4-pole still beside him. She looked better. Some color had returned to her cheeks, and the baby's heartbeat monitor beeped steadily in the background. The doctors say we can both leave tomorrow, Lisa said, her voice still raspy from the smoke. Dad's already moved all my things to a new apartment. He said he's found one for you too. Mr. Johnson nodded, adjusting the bandages on his arms, trying to tell him it's too much. It's not enough. Lisa reached for his hand. Mr. Johnson, you ran into a burning building for us. You could have died. Couldn't let what happened to Sarah happen again. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Lisa's hand tightened on his. Sarah? Mr. Johnson stared at their joined hands for a long moment. He hadn't talked about Sarah to anyone in years, but something about Lisa's presence made the words come easier. My daughter, he said finally, 8 months pregnant, just like you. Different fire, different building. Nobody got to her in time. Oh, Mr. Johnson, tears welled in Lisa's eyes. Was 15 years ago. Her mother, my Martha, she never really recovered. Cancer took her 5 years back. He cleared his throat. When I heard you up there, is that why you came back for me? Partly, but mostly because... He looked at her belly. Life's precious. Couldn't stand by and watch it slip away. Not again. A knock at the door interrupted them. Dr. Patterson entered, followed by a nurse pushing a portable ultrasound machine. Time to check on the little one, the doctor said. Mr. Johnson, you're welcome to stay if Lisa doesn't mind. Lisa immediately gripped his hand tighter. Please stay. The nurse helped Lisa lift her hospital gown over her belly. The ultrasound gel looked cold. Lisa flinched slightly when it touched her skin. Then the image appeared on the screen, grainy but clear enough to make out a tiny face. There she is, Dr. Patterson said, moving the wand carefully. Strong heartbeat, good movement. She's a fighter, just like her mother. Mr. Johnson watched the screen, transfixed. The baby moved, one hand seeming to wave at them. He felt Lisa's fingers squeeze again. "Would you like to hear the heartbeat?" the nurse asked. When they nodded, she flipped a switch. A rapid whooshing filled the room. Strong, steady, alive. Mr. Johnson felt something in his chest loosen, a tension he hadn't even realized he was carrying. "Everything looks perfect," Dr. Patterson announced. "The smoke exposure hasn't affected her development at all. You two are very lucky." After they left, Lisa was quiet for a long moment, one hand resting on her clean belly. "I was so scared," she finally whispered. "When the smoke started coming in, I thought we were going to die. But you didn't." Mr. Johnson's voice was firm. "You're both here. Both breathing. Thanks to you." She looked at him. "Will you tell me about Sarah? If it's not too painful." Mr. Johnson settled back in his wheelchair. For the first time in years, thinking about Sarah didn't feel like a knife in his heart. "She was a teacher," he began. "Third grade. Had your smile, actually. Same kind of light in her eyes." They talked through the afternoon. Mr. Johnson told her about Sarah's childhood, about Martha, about the life they'd had. Lisa shared her own stories, her mother's death when she was young, her father raising her alone, her hopes for her own daughter. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the hospital room, a nurse came to take Mr. Johnson back to his room. "One more thing," Lisa said as he turned to leave. "I've been thinking, would you mind if I named her Sarah?" Mr. Johnson felt his throat tighten. He could only nod before the nurse wheeled him away. Back in his room, he found Mr. Chun waiting with a folder of papers. "The apartment is ready," Mr. Chun said without preamble. "I took the liberty of having some furniture delivered. Basic things: bed, couch, kitchen table. We can get whatever else you need." "Mr. Chun, this is too much. My daughter told me about Sarah." Mr. Chin's voice was gentle but firm. "About what happened to her." "Mr. Johnson, you gave my daughter and granddaughter a chance that Sarah never had. Please, let me give you something in return." Mr. Johnson looked at the papers Mr. Chun held out. A lease agreement, but when he saw the rent amount listed, he started to protest again. "It's non-negotiable," Mr. Chun said. "The apartment is yours for as long as you want it. I've also arranged for a home health aide to help you for the first few weeks while your burns heal." "I don't know what to say." "Say yes. Say you'll let us help you. The way you helped us." Mr. Johnson thought about his old apartment, probably destroyed by now. About the pictures of Martha and Sarah he'd never see again. About the lonely years since losing them both. Then he thought about Lisa's ultrasound, about that tiny hand waving from the screen, about a baby girl who would carry Sarah's name into the future. He took the pen Mr. Chen offered. "Yes," he said and signed his name. The discharge paperwork took longer than expected. Mr. Johnson sat on the edge of his hospital bed, already dressed in new clothes Mr. Chan had brought him, waiting for the final clearance. His burns still stung under the bandages, and his chest felt tight, but he was ready to leave. "Remember," Dr. Patterson said, flipping through his chart, "you'll need to change these bandages daily. The home health aide will help with that. And absolutely no smoking. Quit 20 years ago. Good? Because your lungs took a serious hit. You'll need to use this inhaler for at least a month." The doctor demonstrated the proper technique. 2 puffs, morning and night. More if you're having trouble breathing. A nurse entered with a wheelchair. "Your ride is here, Mr. Johnson." "I can walk. Hospital policy," Dr. Patterson said firmly. "And frankly, you're still weaker than you want to admit. Take it easy for the next few weeks." Doctor's orders. In the hallway, they passed Lisa's room. She was already gone, discharged an hour earlier. Her father had whispered something about getting her settled in her new place before bringing her to see his. The elevator took them to the ground floor, where Mr. Chin waited with a Blacktown car idling at the curb. The driver, a young man in a neat uniform, jumped out to help Mr. Johnson from the wheelchair into the back seat. "The building is about 15 minutes away," Mr. Chin said as they pulled into traffic. "In Highland Park. Much better neighborhood than your old place." Mr. Johnson watched the city pass by outside his window. The car's leather seats were the softest thing he'd touched in years, but he couldn't relax. Everything felt surreal, like he might wake up any moment back in his old apartment. "We're here," Mr. Chin announced as the car turned into a tree-lined street. The building was red brick, 6 stories tall, with well-maintained flower beds out front. Nothing like his old place with its crumbling walls and exposed wiring. "Third floor," Mr. Chun said as they entered the lobby. "Don't worry, elevator works perfectly." Inspected monthly, the elevator was mirrored, making Mr. Johnson all too aware of how he looked. Thin, tired, bandages visible at his wrists where the new shirt sleeves rode up. But the eyes that looked back at him seemed different somehow. Clearer. The apartment was 3C. Mr. Chin unlocked the door with a flourish, stepping back to let Mr. Johnson enter first. The living room was flooded with natural light from large windows. New furniture, still with tags hanging off it, filled the space. A plush couch, coffee table, TV mounted on the wall. The kitchen beyond gleamed with stainless steel appliances. "Bedrooms through there," Mr. Chin pointed. "Bathrooms fully accessible, grab bars, shower seat." Just in case, Mr. Johnson moved slowly through the space, touching things gently as if they might disappear. The bedroom had a queen-sized bed with crisp white sheets, a dresser, nightstands with actual lamps, not the cheap clip-on kind he'd used for years. "Mr. Chun," his voice caught. "The aide will be here in an hour. She'll help you get settled, show you where everything is." Mr. Chin pressed a key ring into his hand. "Building key, apartment key, mailbox key. And this," he pulled out an envelope, "is for anything else you need. Clothes, groceries, whatever." Mr. Johnson tried to refuse the envelope, but Mr. Chin simply placed it on the kitchen counter. "I have a meeting," he said, heading for the door. "But Lisa wants to come by later if you're feeling up to it. Her new place is just down the hall, 3F. After Mr. Chin left, Mr. Johnson stood in the middle of the living room, overwhelmed. The silence was different here. No creaking pipes, no arguments through thin walls. Just peace. His phone buzzed, another new gift from Mr. Chin. A text from Lisa. "Getting settled in. Can't wait to show you the nursery later. Rest well, Redheart." He sat heavily on the couch, feeling the softness envelop him. His chest tightened, but not from smoke this time. How had everything changed so fast? The home health aide arrived exactly on time. Her name was Marie, a sturdy woman in blue scrubs with graying hair and kind eyes. "Let's check those bandages first," she said, setting down her medical bag. "Then I'll help you unpack." The burns looked better when she unwrapped them, still angry red, but healing. She applied fresh ointment and rewrapped them carefully. "You're lucky," she said. "Could have been much worse." "Feel lucky," Mr. Johnson admitted. First time in a long while. Marie helped him organize the kitchen next, showing him where everything was. The cabinets were already stocked with dishes, pots, pans, even food basics. "That Mr. Chun thinks of everything," she said, putting away groceries. "He called me yesterday, gave me a whole list of your medical history, dietary needs, everything." Around sunset, there was a knock at the door. Lisa stood there, looking tired but happy, one hand resting on her belly. "Had to see how you were settling in," she said, hugging him carefully around his bandages. "Dad went all out, didn't he?" "Too much," Mr. Johnson said. "Way too much." "Nothing's too much." She looked around the apartment. "Oh, almost forgot. We saved something from your old place." She hurried back to her apartment, returning with a familiar wooden picture frame. The glass was smoky but intact. Martha smiled up at him from behind it. "The firefighters found it," Lisa explained. "And this one too." She handed him another frame, Sarah's graduation photo. The only two things he'd truly mourned losing. Mr. Johnson had to sit down, the frames trembling in his bandaged hands. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you." Lisa sat beside him, taking one of his hands in hers. "You know what the doctor told me today? He said if you hadn't gotten me out when you did, the smoke would have." She touched her belly. "We both would have." "But I did," Mr. Johnson said firmly. "And you didn't." "No." She smiled through tears. "We didn't. Little Sarah's going to have a chance, thanks to you." Marie tactfully disappeared into the kitchen, leaving them sitting together as the sun set outside the big windows. Mr. Johnson held the picture frames, looking at his past, while beside him Lisa held her belly, looking toward the future. "You'll have to tell her about her namesake someday," he said quietly. We both will. Lisa squeezed his hand. Your family now, whether you like it or not. Family. The word echoed in his chest, filling spaces he thought would stay empty forever. Outside, the city lights began to twinkle on. Inside, in this new place, with these new chances, Mr. Johnson felt something he hadn't felt in years, hope. 1 month later, Mr. Johnson woke to sunlight streaming through his bedroom window. His burns had healed to pink scars, and his breathing was almost back to normal. The inhaler sat on his nightstand next to the photos of Martha and Sarah, now in clean new frames. His morning routine had changed. No more dodging leaks or fighting with ancient appliances. The coffee maker hummed efficiently, filling his kitchen with familiar aromas. His pills were organized in a proper dispenser now, courtesy of Marie, who still came by twice a week despite his protests that he was fine. A knock at his door interrupted breakfast. Lisa stood there, looking ready to burst at 8.5 months pregnant. Help me with my groceries? She asked, though they both knew she didn't really need help. It had become their morning ritual. You shouldn't be carrying anything, he scolded, following her to the elevator. That's why I have you. She smiled, pressing the lobby button. Besides, Dad hired a service to deliver everything. We just have to bring it up from the front desk. In the lobby, Mrs. Torres, the building manager, had their packages waiting. Good morning, Mr. Johnson, Lisa. Beautiful day, isn't it? Mr. Johnson nodded, gathering the grocery bags. The building staff had welcomed him like he'd always lived there, though he sometimes caught them looking at him with admiration when they thought he wasn't watching. Word about the fire had spread. Any day now, right? Mrs. Torres asked Lisa, eyeing her belly. Doctor says it could be any time. Lisa rubbed her back. Little Sarah's getting restless. Back in Lisa's apartment, Mr. Johnson helped put away the groceries while she made tea. Her place was a mirror image of his, but filled with baby things. A crib in the corner, changing table against the wall, tiny clothes folded neatly in baskets. Dad's coming by later, Lisa said, settling carefully onto her couch. Wants to take us both to dinner. Don't need to keep spending money on me. He's not spending money on you. He's spending time with family. She patted the space next to her. Sit. You're making me nervous, standing there. He sat, and she immediately put her feet in his lap. Another part of their routine. Without being asked, he started rubbing them gently. Told Marie not to come by anymore, he said. Burns are healed. Can take care of myself now. Dad's paying her for 6 months, so good luck with that. Lisa winced. Oof. Sarah's doing somersaults today. Let me feel. She grabbed his hand and placed it on her belly. Sure enough, he could feel the baby moving, strong and alive. Just like her namesake, he said softly. Sarah used to kick so hard. Martha said she was practicing for the soccer team. Tell me more about her. Lisa had learned that the best way to get him talking about Sarah was to ask casually, naturally, like she was asking about the weather. She was smart. So smart. Teaching was her calling. Used to practice on her dolls when she was little. Martha would find her in her room, giving history lessons to her teddy bears. She sounds wonderful. She was, he smiled, remembering, would have been a great mother. Like you're a great father. Mr. Johnson looked at her sharply. I'm not. You are? Lisa sat up straighter. You've been more of a father to me in the past month than my biological dad was in 20 years. Before he changed, Mr. Johnson knew the story now. How Lisa's birth father had abandoned her and her mother. How Mr. Chin had married her mother when Lisa was 5, formally adopting her and giving her his name. How he'd raised her alone after her mother's death 3 years later. David's a good man, Mr. Johnson said. So are you? Lisa squeezed his hand. Oh. Her face suddenly tensed. That was a big one. Contraction? I think so. Been having them on and off all morning. Mr. Johnson sat up straighter. All morning? Why didn't you say something? Because they weren't regular. But now. She checked her phone's timer app. About 8 minutes apart. I'm calling your father. Not yet. She gripped his arm. Just stay with me for a bit? Want to make sure it's real. They sat together, timing contractions, neither mentioning how his hand shook slightly when he helped her walk around the apartment. After an hour, when the contractions were 6 minutes apart, he finally called Mr. Chun. On my way. Mr. Chin said immediately. Don't leave without me. Might not have a choice, Mr. Johnson said, watching Lisa breathe through another contraction. Better hurry. He helped Lisa pack her hospital bag, adding last-minute items she'd forgotten. When Mr. Chin arrived 20 minutes later, they were ready to go. The ride to the hospital was tense. Lisa sat between them in the back of the town car, squeezing their hands alternately with each contraction. Mr. Johnson found himself praying silently, the same prayer he'd said in the burning building. Please, not like Sarah. Let this one be different. At the hospital, things moved quickly. The maternity ward staff whisked Lisa away to a delivery room, leaving Mr. Johnson and Mr. Chun in the waiting area. She wants you both there, a nurse said, returning with hospital gowns for them. Says she needs her 2 dads. Mr. Johnson looked at Mr. Chun, who nodded firmly. Both of us, Mr. Chun said. Always. The delivery room was organized chaos. Lisa lay on the bed, already changed into a hospital gown, monitors beeping steadily around her. She reached for them as soon as they entered. Perfect timing, the doctor said. We're getting close. Mr. Johnson took Lisa's left hand, Mr. Chin her right. She looked between them, managing a smile despite the pain. My 2 fathers, she said softly. Sarah's grandfathers. Then another contraction hit, and there was no more time for talking. Lisa's grip on their hands turned fierce as she worked to bring her daughter into the world. You can do this, Mr. Johnson found himself saying. You're stronger than the fire. Stronger than anything. Time seemed to blur. Minutes or hours could have passed as they stood there, supporting Lisa through each contraction. Mr. Johnson's back ached and his legs trembled, but he didn't move. Finally, the doctor looked up. One more push, Lisa. She's almost here. Lisa bore down, squeezing their hands so hard Mr. Johnson felt his fingers go numb. Then, suddenly, a new sound filled the room, a baby's first angry cry. She's here, the doctor announced. Perfect little girl. They laid the baby on Lisa's chest. Tiny, red-faced, absolutely beautiful. Lisa touched her daughter's cheek with trembling fingers. Hello, Sarah, she whispered. We've been waiting for you. Mr. Johnson looked at the baby, through tears he couldn't hold back. This time, the story had a different ending. This time, Sarah would live. Baby Sarah was 6 hours old, sleeping peacefully in the hospital nursery while Lisa got some much-needed rest. Mr. Johnson stood at the nursery window, his nose almost touching the glass. The tiny name card read Sarah Chun in neat hospital script. She looked strong, Mr. Chun said, standing beside him. Got her mother's spirit, Mr. Johnson replied. And her grandmother's nose. He didn't have to specify which grandmother he meant. The baby did have Martha's nose, the same delicate slope he'd loved for 40 years of marriage. A nurse wheeled the bassinet closer to the window, and Sarah stirred, tiny fists waving. 6 pounds, 8 ounces of pure miracle. The firefighters are here, Mr. Chin said quietly. The ones from that night. They wanted to see her. Mr. Johnson turned to see 2 familiar faces approaching. The ones who'd caught him when he'd stumbled out of the burning building with Lisa in his arms, Mr. Johnson, the taller one said. Martinez, according to his uniform. We heard the baby was coming. Wanted to say congratulations. To all of you, his partner added. It's not often we get to see happy endings like this. They all stood there, watching Sarah sleep. Martinez cleared his throat. That night, he said, when we couldn't get up to the 3rd floor, I thought. He shook his head. What you did, sir? That was something else? Just did what needed doing. No. Martinez looked at him seriously. You did what we couldn't. Saved 2 lives that night. Before Mr. Johnson could respond, a nurse approached. She's ready for visitors now, if you'd like to come hold her. The firefighters excused themselves, but not before shaking Mr. Johnson's hand firmly. He and Mr. Chin followed the nurse into the nursery, where they had to scrub their hands and put on clean gowns. Support her head, the nurse instructed as she placed Sarah in Mr. Johnson's arms. There you go. The baby weighed almost nothing, but holding her felt like holding the whole world. She opened her eyes, dark like Lisa's, and seemed to look right at him. Hello, little one, he whispered. I'm your grandpa. One of them, anyway. Sarah yawned, then grabbed his finger with her whole tiny hand. The strength of her grip surprised him. "Fighter," he said, "just like your mama?" Mr. Chun took a photo with his phone. Mr. Johnson holding Sarah, looking down at her like she was made of gold. "For Lisa," he explained. "And for us." They took turns holding her, neither man willing to put her down until the nurse insisted she needed feeding. They wheeled her to Lisa's room, where she was just waking up. "There's my girl," Lisa said as they transferred Sarah into her arms and my dad's. "All my favorite people in one room." The baby latched quickly, and Mr. Johnson turned away to give them privacy. His eyes fell on the window, where the city stretched out below. Somewhere out there were the ruins of his old building, but he couldn't bring himself to care about what he'd lost anymore. Not when he'd gained so much more. "Mr. Johnson?" Lisa's voice pulled him back. "Would you like to feed her? I pumped earlier." He turned to see her holding out a tiny bottle. His hand shook slightly as he took it, along with the precious bundle she offered. "Remember to burp her halfway through," the nurse instructed, "and keep her head elevated." Sarah took to the bottle eagerly, her dark eyes fixed on his face as she drank. Mr. Johnson felt tears threatening again, but didn't try to stop them. "My Sarah used to look at me just like that," he said softly, "like she could see right into my soul." Lisa reached for his hand. "She's watching over us, you know. Her and Martha both." "I know." He smiled down at the baby. "Think they had a hand in all this, sending me to that building that night." Mr. Chun cleared his throat. "The insurance company called. They're declaring the old building a total loss." "Good riddance," Lisa said firmly. "That place was a death trap. Most of the residents have found new places," Mr. Chun added. "I helped some of them with deposits. Least I could do considering—" He didn't finish the sentence, but they all knew what he meant. "Considering they gained a family from that fire." Sarah finished her bottle, and Mr. Johnson carefully lifted her to his shoulder, patting gently like the nurse had shown him. The baby burped, then snuggled into his neck with a contented sigh. "Perfect," Lisa said, watching them. "Like she's always belonged there." "She has," Mr. Johnson replied. "Just took us a while to find each other." The afternoon passed peacefully. Nurses came and went, checking vitals, bringing supplies. Mr. Chin ordered food from Lisa's favorite restaurant, and they had an impromptu celebration in the hospital room. As evening approached, Sarah slept in her bassinet while Lisa dozed. Mr. Chin had stepped out to take a call, leaving Mr. Johnson alone with his thoughts. He looked at the baby, then at Lisa, marveling at how quickly they'd become his world. A month ago, he'd been a lonely old man in a dying building. Now, "Thank you," he whispered to the empty air, knowing Martha and his Sarah would hear him. "For giving me a second chance." Sarah stirred in her sleep, one tiny hand escaping her swaddling. Mr. Johnson gently tucked it back in, remembering doing the same for his daughter all those years ago. Different ending this time, he promised the sleeping baby. "You're going to have the longest, happiest life. Both your grandpas are going to make sure of that." Outside the window, the sun set over Detroit, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Inside, in this quiet room that smelled of new life and fresh starts, Mr. Johnson finally felt at peace. 3 months after Sarah's birth, Mr. Johnson stood in Rose Hill Cemetery, holding a squirming baby while Lisa placed fresh flowers on Martha's grave. The spring air was warm, cherry blossoms drifting on the breeze. "She would have loved her," Lisa said, arranging the roses carefully. "Martha, I mean, and Sarah too. The first Sarah. They both would have spoiled her rotten." Mr. Johnson bounced the baby gently as she fussed. "Just like her grandpas do." Baby Sarah grabbed his collar with surprising strength, drooling on his new shirt. He didn't mind. These days, most of his clothes had baby drool on them anyway. They'd made this visit a weekly ritual. Every Sunday, they brought flowers and updates about the baby. Today felt different, though. Special. "Been thinking," Mr. Johnson said, sitting carefully on the bench across from the graves. "About that night. The fire." Lisa sat beside him, taking Sarah into her arms. "What about it? Could have gone the other way." "Almost did." He touched the faint scars on his arms, but someone gave me strength that night. Felt like Martha and Sarah were there, pushing me up those stairs. They were. Lisa leaned against his shoulder. "Angels watching over us?" The baby cooed, reaching for a falling cherry blossom. Her dark eyes tracked the pink petals, full of wonder at this new discovery. Mr. Chen called this morning, Lisa said after a while. They're demolishing the old building next week. Asked if we wanted to go see it one last time. Mr. Johnson shook his head. Nothing there for us anymore. Everything I need is right here. They sat in comfortable silence, watching Sarah try to catch more falling blossoms. A groundskeeper passed by, nodding respectfully. He knew them now, this odd little family who came every week to talk to their ghosts. Found something yesterday, Lisa said, reaching into the baby bag. In one of the boxes Dad salvaged from your old apartment. She pulled out a worn envelope, yellowed with age. Mr. Johnson recognized Martha's handwriting immediately. Her last letter, he said softly. Wrote it in the hospital, week before she died. Never could bring myself to read it again after. Lisa pressed it into his hand. Maybe it's time? His fingers trembled as he opened the envelope. The paper was fragile, but the words were still clear. My dearest James, if you're reading this again, I'm gone. But that doesn't mean you should stop living. Our Sarah wouldn't want that. I don't want that. There's so much love left in your heart. I've seen it every day for 40 years. Don't let it die with us. Someone out there needs that love. Needs you. When you find them, don't be afraid to open your heart again. We'll be watching, Sarah and I, cheering you on like we always have. All my love, forever, Martha. Mr. Johnson folded the letter carefully, his vision blurring. Baby Sarah chose that moment to reach for him, tiny hands grasping at air until Lisa placed her in his arms. She knew, he said, holding the baby close. Somehow Martha knew. Of course she did. Lisa wiped a tear from his cheek. She was your wife. Your heart. The baby snuggled into his chest, sighing contentedly. Her warmth chased away the old grief, replacing it with something new and precious. Got a family again, he said. Different than before, but still mine. Still yours, Lisa agreed. Always. They stayed until Sarah started getting hungry, her happy coos turning to impatient whimpers. As they gathered their things, Mr. Johnson touched both headstones one last time. Thank you, he whispered. For everything. The drive home was peaceful, Sarah sleeping in her car seat between them. Their building looked welcoming in the afternoon sun, flowers blooming in the carefully tended beds out front. Mrs. Torres held the door for them. Beautiful day for a walk, she said, tickling Sarah's feet as they passed. Oh, Mr. Johnson, those books you ordered for the baby came. Left them with your mail. In the elevator, Lisa smiled. More books? Dad said your place is starting to look like a library. Never too early to start reading. He defended himself. Besides, she likes the pictures. They went to his apartment first, where a stack of children's books waited. Sarah woke up as they settled on his couch, immediately reaching for the bright covers. Story time with Grandpa, Lisa said, taking a picture with her phone. Dad's going to be jealous he missed it. Mr. Johnson opened the first book, Goodnight Moon, one of Sarah's favorites. Baby Sarah watched, entranced, as he turned the pages, pointing out each picture. Look here, he said softly. See the little mouse? And the red balloon? The baby touched the pages with gentle fingers, as if she knew how precious these moments were. Lisa curled up beside them, her head on his shoulder like she belonged there. Because she did belong there. They all did. Outside, Detroit went about its business. Cars honked, people walked. Life moved forward as it always had. But here, in this quiet apartment with its wall of baby books and toys scattered across the floor, time seemed to stand still. Mr. Johnson looked at the photos on his wall. Martha, his Sarah, now joined by pictures of Lisa and baby Sarah. The past and present, loss and love, all woven together into something beautiful and new. Read another one, Grandpa? Lisa asked as he closed the book. Always, he said, reaching for the next story. Always got time for my girls. Sarah clapped her tiny hands, and Mr. Johnson felt his heart swell. This was what Martha had meant in her letter. This was what living looked like. The afternoon sun painted the room gold as his voice filled the space, telling stories to a new generation. On the wall, Martha and Sarah's pictures seemed to smile down at them, guardian angels watching over their little family. Different ending, he thought, holding his granddaughter close. Better ending. And he read on, his voice strong and sure, as Detroit bloomed into spring around them.